And our next session is going to be with Alan Kalisher. And Alan is the program supervisor for the Decision Support Unit at the Connecticut Department of Children and Families. And in his role, he is helping the agency approach their data in better ways by incorporating new technology into work and building organizational capacity to focus on data to make policy and practice decisions. His work builds upon the University of Kansas's prototype results-oriented management, and it's their reports and web-based training, and the Chapin Hall Multi-State Foster Care Data Archive. Alan is an active participant in state, regional, and national efforts to improve child welfare data. Alan holds an MSW with a concentration in administration from the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. So we are now going to hear about how important data is to what we do, policy and practice from Alan.
I want to first just quickly orient you to what I'm going to talk about today. Specifically, the topic is assessing and developing the organizational culture for using data. But the focus of this is very relevant to the work we've done with Kansas University, or University of Kansas, in implementing results-oriented management report system and way of doing business. So I want to start actually with giving you a little context to how we engage in that partnership, and then tell you the story of what we've done and how we fared. So back in the fall of 2003, when we were negotiating our program improvement plan with the feds, they faulted us for essentially choosing strategies that were not measurable. That was, I think, pretty classic around the country, where states would pick simply initiatives like if you're focused on improving permanency planning, you might implement, for instance, concurrent planning training. And while that's very relevant, the feds were looking for, so how do you know if it worked? So we recognized that in adjusting our program improvement plan, that it didn't mean a whole lot unless our managers in the area offices in the field were focused on results. And so we were actually partnering with the National Resource Center for Child Welfare and Data Technology at the time to address this issue, and we talked about implementing a training on use of data in leadership. So as we approached that, we realized that Kansas had a really good online training program, and the content was actually the best content that we could find to really talk about using data and child welfare. So we incorporated that content into our training we did about 5 statewide trainings. We focused on the leaders within each area, jurisdiction, and some other key leaders and quality improvement staff throughout the state. But doing that, we also realized that, again, knowledge now isn't necessarily useful unless you have the tools to use it. So I spoke with the folks over at Kansas University, and they are my co-partners in this effort, and were here actually the last time we did this presentation, but couldn't make it today. And they had actually worked on some prototypes. So that's where we started a formal partnership with them, was to build a report system and incorporate the knowledge of results-oriented management in Connecticut. There was another, what's the word, factor. I was at the perfect storm kind of thing going on at the same time. We were engaged, as we had been for many years, in our lawsuit. But at the time, we were engaged in negotiations for an exit plan from the lawsuit, which meant developing 22 measures, child outcome measures and performance measures. Child outcome measures were very similar to the federal round 1 CFSR measures, but a number of other performance measures. So our idea was that they would be clearly the place where we would focus our efforts in building this system around that. 22 outcome measures. So we started our partnership in April 2004. Our goal was naturally to improve outcomes for children. We felt that the ROM report system would be a vehicle to increase the use of data. It's obviously a quality improvement sort of feedback strategy. And we stayed pretty well focused on those outcomes and performance measures. If you build it, they will come is definitely true. But Kansas already had the experience working with jurisdictions, and certainly didn't, we were no exception, that folks may use it effectively or may not. So our hope was to help build our organizational culture to be results-oriented, to use data effectively. And when with our report system operational, that's where we wanted to turn our focus. So there are some things that, some lessons right off the top that we learned, but it is relative to the contextual issues that were going on in Connecticut. For us, the impetus for performance and outcome measures was a lawsuit. It wasn't a business model. Nobody sat in front of me and I didn't listen and say, hey, that's a great idea. Let's see if we can get that in Connecticut. We would be better off that way. Actually, we were really, as a state, we were taking advantage of the fact that there was a forced accountability going on. So it gave us the leverage to make this happen, but it also came with some costs. Clearly, it helped us quickly establish a set of measures. We had no risk of insufficient commitment or follow-through, and we had a clear basis for reports. I think that's probably the most challenging thing when developing the use of data is exactly what are you going to measure? What are people going to sort of rally around as the things that are important? We didn't have that problem, and that was a major advantage for us. The disadvantages was that that accountability forced heightened resistance. Having practice measured by the numbers, I think for any state at that time, I'm sure you all have moved along in your states along this continuum, but certainly for us at the time, that was brand new. You know, we didn't really evaluate ourselves according to whether or not we had our statistic met a goal. We might actually submit, hand counts of how often we saw families, and in that regard, there was data informing some decisions, but there wasn't this accountability structured throughout the agency as it was once we started this work. We also had no theory specifically promulgated as a state on how to manage with this new focus. And so managers across the state used various approaches. Each manager, in light of their authority, was free to sort of claim that their way was the way. Perhaps the right way. Maybe they didn't believe that, but they certainly were free to do that. And the challenge, of course, is that it's harder to overcome distrust, heightened by those folks that were blame-oriented. So that's been part of our story in terms of developing our organizational culture. Some of the key actions that we took in terms of trying to build the culture, my office, which is now sort of shifted into a different title, but I had a very small two-person at the time originally, Office of Results Management, established really around this whole mission. But we also have quality improvement teams, and we had QI managers established around that time as well. We developed this report system, implemented it. We provided, my office provided training across the state. It's actually interesting. Part of the story was that at the time we implemented this system, there was actually tension within our leadership about how much we should force this kind of force our leadership, our managers across the state to use it. And that came to a head with the decision about whether or not to force area offices to take the training on how to use this new application that, in my mind, would be one of the more powerful things they'd ever encounter as a tool to enable them to make informed decision-making. So I thought, naturally you would want to be part of this, and I would think our leadership would have rallied behind that. But they ultimately decided that they would allow our area offices to choose whether or not they wanted to engage in that. Interesting message, I think, that came of that, but the consequence turned out to be okay because every area office did request the training, and not all at the same time. We had some immediately recognize the value right out of the gate and asked for training for all their managers and supervisors, and we had others that maybe 6 or 7 months into it said, okay, I guess it's time to come around. We should get our folks trained. But it was kind of a nice buy-in strategy, though not, again, by design. So we trained everybody. We used, it was not just a computer training. The idea was to say kind of the things I'm saying today, that there's a way to lead. And I'll probably talk a little more about that later. But our goal there was to try to take action and shape the culture. We had a dramatic increase in the use of reports. In conjunction with this system and in conjunction with other reports that were promulgated for our exit plan. And ultimately, we also took the step of assessing our culture through an organizational culture survey conducted in February 2006. By doing that, we felt we could draw some attention to this very issue. So our report system was key. It's easy to use, more accessible to everyone. That, of course, is an important step in building the culture to use data. The system allows a drill down to case level, so it's very easy, to look at statewide stats right down to actually social worker statistics and grab the cases and see those cases, see what data was used to comprise the score or whatever it may be. And essentially entrust those metrics. And if you can't trust it because the report's wrong, then you know where you need to go into the system to clean up your data and develop your trust. Also enables further analysis in terms of why performance is changing over time or why is performance different between units. We offer a wide variety of variables for folks to look at, sort of intervening variables to why things are going well in some areas or not. For instance, what's the age of your population? What's the race and ethnicity breakdown of your population? So folks can look at those variables in order to assess why there might be some differences. And we also developed a number of views so that folks could work proactively. That was a really big part of this whole model of using data, is that it's not really that useful if you're simply just looking at how did we do in the past. We need to have information that helps us focus on how to improve those performance in the future. So there's a lot of views dedicated to just that fact. Who came into care over the last 12 months that we're focusing on reunification for? Who do we need to work on getting a multidisciplinary assessment for, or to search and document relative efforts? So a lot of views like that help people develop the trust in the data and see the power of using that in their day-to-day decision making. We saw really quickly in implementing this in the end of 2005 a lot of use. We have like somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 staff, 3,500 staff across the state, but that's of course non-line staff in that count as well. And we saw a big utilization right from the start, and then in the next quarter, just about doubled that. So it didn't take long. If you build it, they will come. Certainly showed right out of the gates. We offered face-to-face training. We had incorporated the online training that Kansas offers in terms of what is results-oriented management, providing lessons in the policy context and program improvement and specifically evidence-based practices for achieving child outcome measures. We offered technical support with the system, help documents throughout, definitions, operational definitions, guidance, and we kind of act as a little bit of a help desk too. I get calls all the time about questions. Actually, a lot less now than I used to when we started, but that was all part of developing people's expertise. So again, the training provided us an opportunity to talk about using data effectively and the power of culture. That was a big part of the content. The organizational culture survey created a discussion and understanding of the agency and the culture that we were trying to achieve. We now get questions, and we've gotten questions, I think, relatively soon in this project. How did we ever do business without this? One area director who gets in a half hour before everybody else goes right to the system every morning and checks out where he's at. And if there's a new release in the thing, and he seems to find the one child that just got fixed by that release that morning, and he knows it before I do. And I just said, "You're crazy." But that's how dedicated these folks are. We do view this as a development process, and we look obviously for buy-in at the top levels of the agency. I do have to tell you that a lot of the story is about where we were when we started, and where I believe we've become. And there's sufficient evidence, and I have 2 Connecticut partners here that can keep me honest and tell their stories as well. But we do have a total commitment for this project that was uncertain in the early beginnings, what we do from our senior leadership. So talking a little bit about the theory now about results-oriented management, this is Terry Moore's famous slide, so it's usually his to talk about, but it certainly was mine to talk about as we went around the state, that we were providing them a new report system. But that alone does not achieve a capacity for program improvement. You have to have skills, and the organizational culture are key to actually achieve that program improvement. And so we tried to enforce that. My favorite thing to do was look at the senior leader or leaders in the class and say, this is your responsibility first. It starts with you. If you're not building the culture, then your office won't have it. So this is one of those things that doesn't work that well bottom up. It really does start at the top. Organizational culture is by definition shared understanding about beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors, the shoulds. It's implicit and difficult to change, and it's communicated in many ways. We've seen some of these mechanisms used, meetings, reports, obviously, but even how people display, for instance, performance data on a bulletin board or outside their office door. Do they use a red marker on it? Do they put a smiley face? And I have actually a mentee in the program that Jody runs who does just that. She gives her unit staff stickers, and she says, it's like 4th grade, but they love it, and it's meant to be obviously rewards based. We have a newsletter in our state, and we've tried. We had one specific letter dedicated to recognition of units and the kudos concept. And obviously, like I said, it starts at the top. So leadership and supervision is really important. So our purpose of the survey was to understand more about the culture and the use of performance data. We wanted to do that early on. We're actually getting ready to do it again. So if I do this again in the future, hopefully we'll really be able to show change with the data. KU developed the survey with some things mostly added by me or modified language just to make it understandable to Connecticut staff. There were 26 items, 5 informational questions. We did this through SurveyMonkey, making it easier to get the data collected and analyzed. And essentially, responses were rated on a 5-point Likert scale. Questions were phrased both positively and negatively, and we adjusted the results so we could look at things in a meaningful, simple way. I'm going to not get too much into this stuff. It's in your slides. But I do want to talk a little bit about the results so you have a sense of where things were. These were the scales. Is anybody a researcher in here? If I see yes? Okay, well, then I might be slighting you a little bit when I say this just has to do with how well questions hung together. And that was important for the researchers who did this. So it was good to have actually a partnership in developing a report system with child welfare researchers. That's by the way, I think a key point that I sometimes forget to talk about because I know a lot of states are developing their technological capabilities. But doing it with child welfare professionals is a very different experience than it would be with IT, just pure IT. So we had survey responses from management, our central office administrative staff, field supervisors, social workers, and clinical staff. You can see the breakdown. Out of the 689, only 419 were included due to impartial responses. Okay. In terms of the overall results, we'll give you this in a little bit more understandable format, but the higher the mean was, the more people agreed. So data used routinely is something that was the strongest thing that folks agreed with, and that was, again, early on in the project, so it was interesting to see that. Folks saw that right away. And you can see the one that folks least agreed with was that the environment was safe and rewards-based, and that's most reflective of that culture piece that we are stressing. So this makes it a little bit more understandable. 48% agreed with the data being used routinely, and only 10% agreed that the environment was safe and rewards-based. You can see that it wasn't that they all disagreed. Some were neutral. Actually, most cases were neutral. But we really wanted, to increase that agree category scale. The folks in Kansas are actually doing this project in Montana as well. They started it at the same time, and they surveyed at the same time. Basically, what you're seeing is pretty much similar results across the board, except for data used routinely. There's not really a substantive, significant difference between all the other scales, except for data used routinely. And I take the word of the researcher who did this to say that that's huge. He said, that the difference between that is just is fairly large, and that the context behind that is that we implemented a lot of our reports. I don't know if it was faster. We actually implemented them about the same time, but we had our data reports that were focused on this exit plan, on the things that folks were being held accountable to, not just simply where Montana looked just at the federal measures, things that they weren't all that attached to. So you can see how critical that piece is, that people feel ownership into the information that they're looking at. So the one item that folks agreed most was that reports showing outcome performance are reviewed routinely in staff meetings. So, again, that's something we definitely took pride in. But it's interesting to look at how this differed depending on your role. I should say that we trained across the state managers across the state, and most ultimately all supervisors, but mostly managers. It certainly was geared primarily to the manager, and it's so data used routinely and was most agreed by those supervisors and managers, and you can see how different it was for those folks at the line. Not quite as much for them. So what did we get? People say, I'm more interested in focus on individual cases than on programs and management-like stuff such as policy and procedures. Yes. By the way, you should know that every single one of these bubble quotes were written before we implemented the program. This was forecasted long before we started because this story repeats itself wherever you go. We had comments on the increased use of data and emphasis on achieving outcomes. But then, folks felt the numbers are sometimes overwhelming. We don't embrace performance data in our unit. So some things that were positive or neutral, and evidence of negative, but we had plenty of negative between performance measurement and good practice. In an effort to meet the outcome measures, the quality of care and services children in DCF's care and received has suffered. There was a lot of resistance when we started this. People, I remember just coming into a room where it was icy cold and saying, let's talk about this project. And, staring at a lot of people that definitely were not happy that anybody was going to evaluate their child welfare work with data. But I have to say, and pat on myself, because I did feel like every time we walked out of that room that they warmed up. Because, when you talk about it and you say, you know what, you can't just look at that bottom line. When it's a child outcome measure, there are a lot of things involved. But this is about having information and using it as a tool. Obviously, you've probably heard many comments like data doesn't, or reports, they don't make change. They're tools to enable change. And so that kind of message, I think, was embraced. Sometimes took more slowly than in other places. I did have the experience also walking in rooms where I was like, wow, this is unbelievable. It's like this whole place is just, positively oriented. It's nice to kind of compliment the leadership in an area office when you're out there, and they felt proud of the things that they were doing in their office to kind of create and foster that environment. So the credit always goes to those local leaders that make that happen. But as I said, this survey was done early in the project, and we encountered a lot of experiences that were similar to these comments. Another skill, learning encouraged. Is learning encouraged? Performance data, first item that folks agreed most with was performance data are analyzed carefully to understand reasons underlying performance. Actually, it doesn't look like that's the highest, but that is listed first. We talked a lot about the fact that when you deal with results, when you look at how you're doing, it's critical to find why it is. The question, if you don't ask the why, then you're not really developing capacity for program improvement, because the whole point, obviously, is to say, how are we doing? Why are we doing this well or not this well? And what can we do to make change there? So we talked about, do you involve your front staff in thinking about strategies in your area office to improve performance? So this, of course, was to evaluate that. This is the scale where we saw more agreement than others, but certainly could be better. Area management staff agreed 30% of the time, and field supervisors 20% of the time. Actually, in this case, interesting, the supervisors and the workers are pretty similar. But again, managers show the higher rate of agreement, but they're also the folks responsible for doing it. So, but interesting though that 2% disagree with that. 70% are neutral, and I'm thinking that if you're a manager in the area office and you're asked, is learning encouraged? I'm thinking, if I'm one, I'm saying, how well do I do it? And so it's a pretty telling thing that 70% just about stayed neutral on that question, on that scale. Yep, that quote does fit a lot of people's feelings, that they feel like it's just something to get reprimanded for data. And so we saw a lot of comments that fit that. Change of reports is somewhat pointless if we can't do something with the information, if we can't discern the real underlying reasons. Staff are encouraged to adapt, but it's more, this needs to get done, so figure it out, than a supportive process. So there's a lot of urgency that came along with our accountability and not necessarily creative thinking early on. Not to say that it didn't exist, but certainly around the culture there was challenges. Was positive action taken? Do folks learn and then take positive action towards improving things? Are we reallocating resources? Interestingly, by the way, we had one area office reallocate staff or change the way that they looked at handling investigations. They thought that might better support good services at the investigation stage. And while we were training, we just came across the data where we were sort of drilling down and looking at the state's trend and looking at each area office performance and saying, okay, here's a weaker one. Let's drill down to this area office and then look at their trend over that time. And what we saw was this high performance and then this drop. And then bing, 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 right back up. And somebody in there told us, yeah, they tried something and it failed, so they went back to the way it was. So, having that data to help you quickly, in real time, tell you, is this working? Not everything you do is necessarily going to improve things, but to have the data to help you, that's positive action. Again, agreeing with the management staff, and in this case, the supervisors, were the least to agree. So you see how the story is kind of interesting? Anybody have a theory on that, by the way? Out of curiosity? Again, this is, I think, where do you see yourself as an agent of change? How much are you sort of subject to the people ahead of you or supervising you in terms of what you can do? The pressure to achieve good outcomes will force managers and workers to do something contrary to the best interest of the child. That, of course, typifies that cold feeling that we saw a lot. But we had some good comments as well. People were encouraged about quality improvement teams, but they didn't feel like that question why necessarily was asked. They feel like staff would be the best people to develop plans and are not always involved. So there was a lot of change going on, and I think people that probably also added to resistance. As you see, the last comment that was talking about our reorganization. We had 5 regions and reorganized to 13 or 14 area offices. So there was that to coincide with all of this as well. There was some feeling hopeless. I worry about these outcomes and fear the effort for meeting these outcomes will affect practice in negative ways. They didn't feel like we could actually achieve improvement on outcomes. They felt like the pressure was there, but the reality wasn't. I should say, by the way, that we, out of the 22 measures that we're focused really on mainly 2 now, because we've hit and sustained 16, 17 of the outcomes now, and we saw steady progress of that take place. So that feeling was dissipated a lot by the reality that a lot of the outcomes were achieved. Not to say that they're always achieved, and there are also issues with metrics, by the way, and I'll try to stay off that soapbox right now, but some of the issues are problematic because of metrics. I actually figured I'd end up telling one story today that I encountered yesterday, so it kind of relates to all this as well as an issue of metrics. I got a call yesterday from a manager in one of the area offices. She was in panic because she had 3 children that were who exited to a guardian in the last quarter, and 2 of the children had left within 2 years, meeting the goal that they achieved permanency within 2 years, specifically a guardianship exit within 2 years. But the 3rd child did not, and so she's looking at a 67% exit cohort success rate. And our goal is something in the 70s, 73. I don't even remember because it's almost pointless to me to think of permanency this way. But she was very concerned because she said that their plan for this child was permanent foster care, that the child was doing well in foster home. They had a great life for this child. I thought there was a little bit of an oxymoron there, but and they never intended for her to leave. But the judge forced them to have that child discharged to a relative, and this child's been in care for a long time, and it was out of my control. And now my performance statistics are worse, and my management objectives are at risk. So we're not all the way there yet. because we're still accountable to some of these measures that are counterproductive or intuitive or whatever word you want to use. They're certainly counter good. But what I said to her was that there's a number of problems with her conclusion. One, you have 3 children you're talking about. When you have 3 children, you can't evaluate performance with 3. I said 2, you have a child who just achieved a successful exit. You should be proud of that, and it shouldn't matter that this was taking a long time. I mean, that's our goal, to get those kids to permanent exits. 3, that when you look at children only at the point of discharge, you really suffer if you're looking at timeliness. You know, we can think about that child when that child is in care 2 years and say, well, we failed to achieve permanency in 2 years for that child. That was our goal. That's when we should think about that. After that, we should be still working towards permanency, but not specifically be focused on the 2-year mark. It shouldn't be that 10 years into care that the child goes, and now we think, oh, geez, we did the wrong thing for this child, or I'm getting dinged for something the judge did. But I said, you know, I don't think I would ever be defensive about met, not met, about a child outcome if I did what was right for that child. So she said, okay, you made me feel better, but, and I said, and I have to tell you a little more about this. She said, so if I hadn't documented that in the legal the way we did, that kid never would have showed up, right? And I said, name. I don't want to answer that question because that's not the right question. And, so you do have to worry about those influences, and I joked about that actually early on, that people are going to learn. Don't reunify, don't adopt, don't send kids to guardians if they've been in care after 2 years. Don't think that some people aren't going to actually get that lesson out of these measures that say failure when you leave if you've left after 2 years. We need to look at things. You've probably heard it a number of times. I know for me, I was on the soapbox of entry cohorts early on in this project. That's why we did a lot of this. We offered alternative views. In fact, we didn't actually let folks drill down to the cases that comprise the exit plan view. We said, if you want to look at performance and you want to know about cases, go to the entry cohort. We had changed that when we became the official report system for our exit plan, but we knew we needed to. But there are things that we did to try to encourage, and we still do to try to encourage folks to understand where it matters. I did say to her, I said, with performance measures, it's a little bit easier to make the claim that this is about whether you did things. If you're looking at yourself in the aggregate, about your ability to see children on a monthly basis or get investigations completed or commenced on time. Sure, in the aggregate, you can say that if that number is going up or down, or if I'm higher or lower than somebody, that may be reflective of something I can control. On an individual case basis, even the performance measures are questionable. But on a child outcome measure, you've got to use this information to help you focus and do what's right for the kid, not to grade yourself. So there's a lot of that stuff we continue to obviously try to influence. And this survey was, again, at a time where everybody resisted this for these reasons. Some embraced the value of it too, but I think everybody had worry. Again, part of the actual context of what's going on. Do we involve key stakeholders? I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. We didn't have a lot of agreement. You can see area office management just only agreed 10%. This is a big bugaboo in our state. How do we involve our stakeholders outside the agency in decision making? Certainly one thing the feds have been on our case about as well. So we agree apparently, we didn't see a lot of comments on it, but folks, other than we need to do it. Is the environment safe and rewards based? And remember, this is the scale where we had the least agreement. Management staff agreed only 30% of the time. Field supervisors 4%. That's a big, big, big issue. Again, I'll talk a little bit probably further about this, but just to reiterate, I'm very relaxed about the fact that things have changed a lot. in this area. So I'm looking forward to our next results. But all part of the developmental process was getting towards where folks will say they feel this way. Folks thinking that negative outcomes are shared regularly and positive outcomes are shared inconsistently. But then someone said positive recognition has recently increased. So even as early in that project, they started to see, most folks I think started with that. We're not seeing that, but in some areas, even as early as this, there was recognition that people were making that effort. One of my favorites. We were taught that ROM would be used to help supervisors see what workers needed assistance in visiting clients regularly. But in this office, the sheets are posted on a wall and used to shame the workers who are behind. There's somebody who actually recognized that there was a lesson in how you do this, but that it was being used just in the opposite way. And that's that piece, like I said, where we made some key actions. We clearly influenced somebody in thinking that this is the way to do it, but we didn't have that theory universally supported across the state. And managers were permitted to do things the way they felt they should. So that was one of those sort of notorious stories that went across. Actually heard of it besides the fact that it was written in the survey. There was a few items that didn't hang together. They weren't part of any of the 5 scales. Let's see those. More agreement you see in policy and practice decisions are made in light of their impact on achieving outcomes. And the last one. The single most agreed to item, one that did not hang with other scales, was that staff, including managers, see their ability to impact outcomes as greatly diminished by the lack of control and influence they have over forces outside the agency. And so, one thing I think in all of this that's really critical is for people to feel that they have power to make some change despite that fact. And that is often true, but it's also, I think, often an excuse. So it's one of those things where if you're results-oriented, you won't stop because simply you know that the court ultimately has the final say. You'll make a better case, you'll make stronger efforts, you will engage family, you will search for relatives. There's things you can do to impact this. I should say, by the way, that I started with doing this work and specifically focusing on permanency as my big passion. So this system, it features a lot on permanency for the reasons that child welfare knows it's important. Right, see where that broke down by staff? Again, this is that quote that fits that point. And you can see how much they agreed. So we asked a few more questions because we wanted to also evaluate whether people felt that there was some change. And we also thought it would be wise to say, is there any relationship to how you evaluate the organizational culture with whether or not you've been part of the training that we offered or took the online training that Kansas University offers. And so we asked those questions, and we did see 32% gotten somewhat better and 8%. So 40% felt it got better. 42 didn't feel there was a whole lot of difference. Again, this being early on, we already were seeing a lot of people feel like things had changed, and not so many that actually thought that the culture was getting worse. Of course, management staff were much higher to agree with that, much more likely. And while field supervisors were also more likely than workers, you see they also were more likely to think it got worse. So we had some very strong comments too, very positive comments about this whole project and how things were going. They saw, for instance, that folks were using the ROM system, that there was more willingness to use data in a proactive way. People were being encouraged to see data as a tool that can improve case practice. That's exactly the point. And a variety of other positive comments in this effort. Implications and ideas. We certainly learned changing attitudes and beliefs are difficult and only happen over time. We've learned our culture has improved, and I think we're still learning that. And there certainly was an indication that the training helped. It was a statistical significance that folks who had been part of it were more likely to see the culture positively. Sort of fast forwarding to the future, there's been a continued growth in the use, buy-in, and trust, and that's I can't state that it's probably strongly enough that it's been a tremendous growth in all those areas. Certainly, I can show you the data on use fairly easily. You see the two lighter shaded yellow bars are the two I showed you the first 2 quarters, where we had a big jump in use in the second, certainly a lot in the first, and it just continued to climb to the point where you're seeing, over 25,000 hits in the first quarter of this year. I need to update this probably with a couple more quarters, but we know that folks are using this more and more and more, and I'm just going to hold this for now. We also are adding more reports, so we're going to see more hits because of that. We've more recently implemented structured decision making, and we're just testing right now a series of reports that will give staff that proactive ability to look at which assessments need to be done, what % of assessments have I done on time or done late, or not done at all. So there are things like that are central to the things that folks are obligated to do, we know have been a key. We also know that we're not meeting everybody's needs yet either, because there's a lot of business areas that are not covered. Had that conversation a little earlier today. We have an improved culture. We have improved outcomes, as I mentioned. And we're seeing a desire for more sophisticated indicators building, especially at the senior level. We're in a transition still. I'm going to say that for a while, I think, with our new commissioner. So I think we're kind of feeling out some of the stuff that was initiated in our last administration. But I know, as of yesterday, talking with one person involved in this, that there's still a hunger to build our own accountability framework. It's probably not going to be called that, but that something that essentially represents what would be our report card, our thing, what we feel like we should be held accountable to, what indicators work for us, how we decide what our priorities are, and how we link that to finance. So that is definitely growing, and certainly with negotiations with our plaintiffs in our lawsuit, it's forced us to take a deeper look, because we're going to be otherwise constantly on the defensive. That they are using our data, for instance, to represent whether we're doing well or not, and we want to sort of grow beyond the limitation of indicators that we've been sort of forced and held accountable to, and start developing those that are more sophisticated. We have formalized responsibility for shaping inquiry through this, what I mentioned now is our decision support unit. There's a group of us that work specifically around data and reports and requests for information. I think I was sending a note to our fiscal officer for our budget office today, actually, about how often kids come into care after being served in protective services. And so we have questions like that we serve, but we also try to shape the way you go about answering that in a way that provides a valid picture. We have embraced a logic model, developed through a variety of sort of a hybrid of a variety of tools that are out there, but have developed one for our state and embraced that for all our contracts, and that's a really important part of sort of evaluation, outcome planning at the contract level. And we're working on building consistent data concepts. In fact, the one that we're undertaking right now is how we define race and ethnicity. Recognizing that there are so many things that go into how you reflect on what your disproportionality and disparity rates are. We know we have to have a common framework for thinking about what a person's race is. We know we have to have a system that supports that in terms of how they document it. And we know we have to have field staff trained on how you ask questions. And ultimately, then you have to have a way to represent it that's valid. So we're going through all of that. We actually are furthest along in representing a valid picture of disproportionality and disparity. Where we're struggling is the various ways to interpret that data. Not that we don't have ideas, but we need to try to get some consensus for the state on how to go about that. And that's an important piece of work. I'm kind of assuming that when it's done, it probably will be something shared, because it's a pretty laborious effort. And we are working to organize and specify data solutions to all kinds of questions. The road ahead, we're further developing ROM, where we actually are building in the round 2 measures as for our senior leadership. Just so happens that there's no decision, and I'm certainly not choosing to make that public for the state, because I feel we just don't put out reports. We need to kind of decide that that's a relevant issue that we want to hold ourselves accountable to. Certainly the feds hold us accountable to it, and we know we need to know it to be informed. So we're building that kind of those reports as well as others. We're also building new analytic power. One of the new features in this application is that we've added a filter option, so that for any given report, when you're looking at performance on a measure, whether for your unit, for the state, or over a period of time, you can also look at that performance on a filtered basis. So I can decide to say I'm going to look at how different racial groups fare in terms of achieving permanency, or how different age groups of entry, or whatever, kids in certain placement types. A number of all those variables that we provide in the detail are now also optional for filtering. The nice thing about that is that you can look across measures. If I create a filter for instance, to focus in on a specific race group or infants, I can look at every measure with that filter active where it's relevant, and sort of give that power to the users, not just sort of hoard it at a central office level and sort of through data reports that folks don't have time to read. This is a consumer-driven process. We're also continuing to invest in, as I said, that accountability framework concept, and we're trying to build capacity for richer analysis. We want to get better data from our service providers. We want to have connections with other data systems to have more interoperability. And we offer advanced training. We've gone back out to area offices, to managers that have requested it. We've said, for instance, actually permanency groups have asked us to come out and say, how do we use these reports to focus on achieving better permanency? We've developed sort of tip sheets as well. So how do you use a distribution view specifically to focus on permanency? So we're doing that, and we'll continue to do that with this tool and other tools that we support. And we're going to evaluate change. That's, as I said, we're about to resurvey, so we feel like that's an important part, and hopefully have some notion of a practice model related to this is kind of the idea. I won't go through this too much, but I do want to say a couple of things in terms of lessons here and somewhat part of the theory that examining communication methods and opportunities are a certain part of this. Addressing those non-useful beliefs and promoting positive messages, obviously something that we try to do, and there's a very specific, I would say, the word I'm looking for is totally escaping me right now. You can expect these kinds of things to have to confront, so I'll go with that. There are also many avenues for strategic communication to move culture in a positive direction. We've used, as I said, newsletters and presentations, trainings, and meetings. We also had a quality improvement kickoff early in this whole project. It was an effort to try to embrace this notion of a quality improvement team and this type of work. So that was a nice strategy as well. So here are the 7 steps we've talked about that in terms of evaluation, but just to keep them in mind, what is involved in developing a results-oriented culture. Definitely the things we say, the leader has to take responsibility at the top. It's not about blaming, it's about standing up. I've actually heard one of our consultant partners talk about this notion of leadership, and some of the folks that you might attribute or think about when you think of these iconic leaders like Donald Trump, Lee Iacocca, that stand up there and say, kudos to me, look what I've done, look how much money I've made. When something goes wrong, deny it or blame somebody else. That's not really effective leadership. So we talk about the idea that something goes wrong and your leadership, you take responsibility. When something goes well, you give credit. That's the rewards-based part. You lead those improvement efforts. You involve people. You stimulate positive action. You encourage learning. Some strategies, and I'll just leave this in your notes more than anything else, but to use data routinely and to encourage learning. Our hope to integrate, we talked actually about integrating program improvement strategies. If you have a lot of states will use a template or something for their, like a development plan, sort of like a program improvement plan, as the feds have their template. And we have had one that's not so much a state template, but an expectation for development plans at the area office. And one idea we've talked about is incorporating that into the data report system, so that people can sort of track what their development plans are against their performance. That's going to happen to me. So there's different ideas that we are still exploring, but there's a lot of things folks you can do for that as well. Clearly, we do want to promote involving stakeholders in this. We think of that the great models of quality improvement teams or advisory councils where you bring those folks in and talk about performance, show data, and talk about solutions. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure everybody would raise their hand if I ask you, how many times have you been with a provider that says, if you just asked us or involved us, we have these ideas. And so that's what it's about. It's about engaging them at the table of decision making. Another idea that I think is maybe gaining a little momentum, at least with a couple of people I've heard now saying that they have this idea instead of me telling them this idea, which is great, that we offer, we're a little more transparent, that we might do a public version, for instance, where we don't allow case level drill down, but which is quite simple. It's a little switch in a table. But that we show our performance. That's one way to engage stakeholders. And you can select measures that matter most. Clearly, creating a safe and rewards-based environment is incredibly important in all of this. We've done a little bit of that, like I said, through the newsletter. We have a feature to send kudos through our training and just face-to-face efforts. We try to do that. That's really it. I have contact information for myself if you ever want to be in touch, and also Terry Moore and Alan Press, both part of the project at the University of Kansas. I would say Terry is behind more of the academic side of this, and Alan is behind more of the metrics research data part of it, so that you know who you're dealing with. The training is also available to anyone, the online training that is. It's a great tool, especially for recruiting and even for advanced folks in trying to learn these kinds of ways of doing business. And so you can also look at that. Lastly, I should tell you that you can actually get a demo if you're interested in looking at that this report system, this model for delivering data, by contacting Terry or Alan. Okay.